What happens when Hollywood's most charming Australian actor meets late-night television's sharpest tongue, and things go completely sideways? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that left audiences stunned, and Chris Hemsworth walking off the Jimmy Kimmel live set. This isn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how quickly things can escalate when two strong personalities clash over something neither of them saw coming. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story has layers that will blow your mind. It started like any other Tuesday night taping at the El Capitan Entertainment Center. Chris Hemsworth, fresh off promoting his latest action thriller, walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel live stage with that trademark Thor smile and the kind of confidence that comes from being one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. The audience erupted in their usual enthusiastic applause, phones came out for pictures, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Jimmy, wearing his signature navy suit and that mischievous grin that his fans know all too well, welcomed Chris with the kind of warm energy that had made him a late-night television staple for over 2 decades. The interview began smoothly enough. They chatted about Chris's workout routine, his kids back in Australia, and the usual promotional talking points about his new film. The audience was eating it up, laughing at Jimmy's perfectly timed jokes, and Chris's self-deprecating humor about his accent, and his brother Liam's recent engagement. Everything was going exactly according to the pre-interview notes that the producers had carefully crafted. But then Jimmy did what Jimmy does best: he went off script. "You know, Chris," Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair with that look that regular viewers know means trouble is coming, "I've got to ask you about something that's been bothering me for weeks now." Chris shifted slightly in his seat, still smiling but with a hint of wariness creeping into his eyes. He'd done enough late-night shows to know when a host was about to pivot into uncharted territory. "Sure, mate. Fire away," Chris replied, his Australian accent becoming slightly more pronounced, as it always did when he was being cautious. Jimmy pulled out a tablet and held it up so the camera could catch it. "This is from your interview with Entertainment Weekly 3 weeks ago. You said, and I quote, that late-night television has become predictable and formulaic, that hosts rely too heavily on prepared material and don't really engage with their guests authentically anymore." The studio fell silent. You could hear the hum of the cameras and the slight creak of Jimmy's chair as he leaned forward. Chris's smile faltered for just a moment before he tried to recover. "Well, Jimmy, I think context is pretty important here," Chris began, but Jimmy was already shaking his head. No, let me read the whole quote because I think our audience deserves to hear exactly what you said." Jimmy's voice had taken on that edge that made his comedy work so well, but now it wasn't being used for laughs. "You said that most late-night hosts are basically performing the same show every night with different guests, and that the format has become stale because everyone's afraid to have real conversations." The tension in the studio was palpable now. Audience members were looking at each other uncertainly, not sure if this was part of some elaborate bit or if they were witnessing an actual confrontation. Chris ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that anyone who'd watched his interviews knew was his tell when he was uncomfortable. "Look, Jimmy, that wasn't specifically about you or your show. I was talking about the industry in general, about how—" "But you did this show 6 months ago," Jimmy interrupted, his voice getting sharper. "You sat right there in that same chair, and we had what I thought was a great conversation about your family, your career, your passion projects. Was that formulaic to you? Was I not engaging with you authentically?" The camera caught Chris's jaw tightening slightly, the first real sign that the Thor actor's famous composure was starting to crack. Chris took a deep breath, and for a moment it looked like he might try to smooth things over with a joke or a diplomatic response. But something in Jimmy's tone had clearly struck a nerve. "You know what, Jimmy, since we're talking about authenticity, let me be completely honest with you," Chris said, his voice calm but with an underlying steel that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. That interview 6 months ago, yeah, we talked about my family and my career. But do you remember what we didn't talk about? The fact that I'd just come off a really difficult shoot where I was dealing with some serious personal stuff, and your producer specifically told me beforehand that we weren't going to go there because it might make the audience uncomfortable. Jimmy's expression shifted slightly, caught off guard by Chris's directness. Chris, we always work with our guests to make sure they're comfortable with the topics we cover. That's just good hosting. But Chris was shaking his head, warming up to his point now. That's exactly what I'm talking about, though. Everything is so sanitized, so safe. We can talk about my workout routine and my kids' funny stories, but anything that might show a real human being dealing with real problems, that's off limits because it might mess with the show's rhythm. The audience was completely silent now, watching this unfold like a tennis match. Jimmy's famous quick wit seemed momentarily stunned by Chris's unexpected counterattack. So what? You're saying I should have blindsided you with personal questions about whatever you were going through? Jimmy's voice had a defensive edge now. That's not authentic. That's ambush journalism. No, Jimmy. I'm saying that maybe if late-night TV allowed for actual human moments instead of just promotional opportunities, we wouldn't have this problem, where celebrities feel like they have to put on a performance every time they sit down for an interview. Chris leaned forward now, his hands clasped together, looking more engaged than he had since the interview started. You want to know what's authentic? This conversation right now. This is the first time in 20 minutes that I feel like we're actually talking to each other instead of performing for the cameras. Jimmy paused, and for a split second it looked like he might concede the point. But then his competitive instinct kicked in, the same drive that had kept him at the top of late-night television for years. You know what, Chris? That's a nice speech. But let's talk about performance. You're sitting here criticizing the format while you're literally here to promote your movie. You think the audience doesn't know that? You think they don't understand that this entire conversation, including this part right now, is ultimately about getting people to buy tickets to see your latest action flick? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Chris's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, realization, and then something that looked almost like admiration for Jimmy's ability to turn the tables. That's fair, Chris said slowly. But at least now we're having a real conversation about it, instead of pretending otherwise. Real conversation? Jimmy's voice rose slightly, and the audience could sense they were approaching the point of no return. You want a real conversation? Let's have one. You come on these shows, you smile and wave and tell your charming stories, you cash your checks and go home to your mansion. Then you give interviews to magazines talking about how the whole system is broken and how hosts like me are just going through the motions. You want authenticity? How about the authentic experience of a host who's been doing this for 20 years, trying to create something entertaining every single night, while actors like you show up and judge the whole enterprise? Chris stood up from his chair, not in anger, but in a kind of restless energy that everyone who knew him recognized. It was the same way he moved when he was getting ready for a particularly intense scene. You're right, Jimmy, and I apologize for that. I should have been more thoughtful about how I expressed those thoughts. But here's what I don't understand. Why are you taking this so personally? I never mentioned your name. I never said your show specifically was the problem. Because this is my show, Jimmy shot back, also standing now. This is my life's work. When you say late-night television is formulaic and predictable, you're talking about what I do every single night. When you say hosts don't engage authentically, you're talking about me sitting here trying to make people laugh and forget about their problems for an hour before they go to bed. The studio fell into an eerie quiet. Camera operators looked at each other uncertainly, producers were frantically whispering into headsets, and the audience sat frozen, unsure whether they should clap, boo, or just sit there in stunned silence. This had gone far beyond the usual late-night television banter into something raw and real that nobody quite knew how to handle. Part 3. Final. Chris looked at Jimmy for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly. Jimmy, I get it. I really do. This is your career, your legacy, and I came across like I was dismissing all of that. But you're doing the exact same thing to me right now. You're reducing everything I said to some kind of entitled actor complaint when what I was actually trying to talk about was something I think we both care about. He gestured toward the audience, many of whom were now leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed despite the awkwardness. Look at them. Look at how engaged they are right now compared to 20 minutes ago when we were talking about my workout routine. Jimmy glanced at the audience and then back at Chris, his jaw working as he processed this observation. So what, you're saying you planned this? You came on my show intending to create some kind of confrontation for the sake of authenticity? There was genuine curiosity mixed with suspicion in his voice now. No, Jimmy, I didn't plan any of this, but I'm not going to pretend it's not the most interesting conversation I've had on a talk show in years. Chris sat back down, but remained on the edge of his seat, his body language still intense. And I think you feel the same way, even if you're angry about how we got here. Jimmy remained standing, pacing slightly behind his desk in a way that reminded everyone why he'd been so successful in late-night television. His timing, even in an unscripted moment like this, was impeccable. You know what the real problem is, Chris? The real problem is that you're probably right. About some of it anyway. But you said it in a magazine interview instead of saying it to my face when you were sitting right there 6 months ago. That's what bothers me. If you thought our conversation was inauthentic, why didn't you make it authentic? Why didn't you say, hey Jimmy, I'm going through some stuff right now, and I'd rather talk about that than my latest movie? Chris was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but more intense. Because I was scared. Because talking about real problems on television is terrifying when you're used to controlling your image. Because I didn't know if you wanted that kind of conversation, or if you were just trying to get through your segment list for the night. He paused, looking directly at Jimmy. And because I didn't know if you'd handle it with the kind of care that those conversations require. And now? Jimmy asked, his voice equally quiet. Now I think you would have. I think this conversation proves that you're capable of a lot more than the format usually allows for. Chris leaned back slightly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. But Jimmy, can I ask you something? When was the last time you had a conversation on this show that surprised you? Really surprised you? In a way that made you forget about the cameras and the audience and the commercial breaks? Jimmy considered this for a long moment, and the studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Honestly? Right. Now, this conversation right now. He sat back down behind his desk, but his posture was different now, less performative. But Chris, here's what you don't understand about this job. Surprise can be dangerous in live television. Surprise can mean dead air, or uncomfortable moments that make viewers change the channel, or conversations that go places that hurt people. But it can also mean connection, Chris countered. It can mean the audience sees something real instead of something manufactured. Look, I'm not saying every interview needs to be a therapy session or some kind of deep dive into personal trauma, but maybe there's a middle ground between total safety and total chaos. Jimmy nodded slowly, and for a moment it seemed like they might actually find some common ground. But then he shook his head, and his expression hardened again. You know? What though, Chris? You still haven't answered my original question. You criticized late-night television in a magazine, but you're still here. You're still doing the promotional circuit, still playing the game you claim is broken. So what does that make you? The question hit Chris like a physical blow, and his face went through a series of expressions before settling into something that looked almost like resignation, mixed with frustration. You're right, Jimmy. You're absolutely right. I am playing a game I criticize, and that does make me a hypocrite. He stood up again, but this time there was something different in his posture, something final. But you know what? At least I'm admitting it. At least I'm trying to figure out how to do better instead of just defending the status quo because it's worked for me so far. Chris, come on, Jimmy said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice now. Sit down. Let's figure this out. This is exactly the kind of conversation you said you wanted to have. But Chris was already reaching behind him to unclip his microphone. Jimmy, this has been the most honest conversation I've had on television in years, and I mean that. But I think we've both said what we needed to say, and I don't think continuing this is going to help either of us. He handed the microphone to a confused-looking sound technician who had appeared at his elbow. I hope your audience got something out of this because I sure did. Jimmy stood up again, clearly not ready for the conversation to end this way. Chris, wait. We can work this out. This doesn't have to end like this. But Chris was already walking toward the edge of the stage, acknowledging the stunned audience with a small wave and what might have been an apologetic smile. Jimmy, Chris called back over his shoulder, for what it's worth, I think you're one of the best at what you do. I just think what we do might need to evolve. And with that, he disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Jimmy standing alone on stage with an audience that didn't know whether to clap, boo, or sit in stunned silence. Jimmy looked out at the crowd for a moment, his face cycling through confusion, frustration, and something that might have been respect. Well, he said finally, his voice carrying across the silent studio, I guess that's what authenticity looks like. The audience erupted in a mixture of applause and confused murmuring, but Jimmy had already turned away from them, walking toward his desk with the kind of measured steps that suggested he was still processing everything that had just happened. The cameras kept rolling for another few seconds, capturing Jimmy as he sat down heavily in his chair, ran a hand through his hair, and looked directly into the camera with an expression that was impossible to read. Then the director finally called cut, and the spell was broken. So there you have it, the explosive confrontation that left both Chris Hemsworth and Jimmy Kimmel exposed in ways that neither of them had probably planned for. Two professionals at the top of their game, stripped of their usual personas and forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about their industry and themselves. Make sure to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories that show you what really happens when the cameras are rolling, and comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Chris was right to walk off, or should he have stayed to work things out with Jimmy?